How's that? Now I'm going to have to tone my voice down. All right, if it starts to get too loud, if I get excited, somebody in the back row, please just hold up your hand and I'll adjust. Thank you again for having me here. It's an honor to be here. It's especially humbling to see the list of people who have come before me. These are all scholars that I respect so much, and I should say likewise for the faculty here. It's a terrific environmental law faculty, and so it's quite an honor to be here, and I thank you for having me. The title of the talk for today is The Regulatory Contract in the Marketplace. And just to give you a little bit of background, this is a project that I'm working on with Dave Spence, who's at University of Texas at Austin. Some of you may have heard him speak last week at the symposium. He was here for that. And what we're trying to do here is build on some of the work we've done independently as well as together on electricity fuels, markets, nuclear power, governance, and administrative law. So quite a mix of fields that we're considering in this particular project. The project is focused on the intersection of two visions for energy policy. Especially for electricity, one of the visions is to have more efficient grids, markets that lower prices for consumers and allow electricity to be transferred very quickly. The other vision is for an ever greener grid, one that replaces especially fossil-fueled power with renewables. Now, sometimes these two visions can align quite well in terms of policy options for implementing them, but there are tensions. They do sometimes work at cross purposes. And at the heart of this consideration of two visions is the regulatory contract. This dates back at least to the Industrial Revolution. And the idea is simply that states regulate public utilities. They regulate the prices that are charged, ensure that those prices are just and reasonable. States say who can enter the market, what can be built, and they impose on the utility a duty to serve the market that they are assigned. In return, utilities get monopoly service over a fixed territory, and they're able to recoup their costs through those rates that the State Utility Commission sets. So they can recoup the cost of providing the service, and then they are guaranteed a reasonable return on their investment. Well, what has this done for us? It gets us infrastructure. It gets us railroads, mills have been built on this model, roads, and then of course most of our energy infrastructure as well has been based on this particular model. But it's been changing, all right? What we see now are shifts to markets, decreasing incentives for investors to want to be involved in those high infrastructure, high capital costs. And our premise is that in the quest to lower prices on markets and minimize cost, those markets have started failing to value reliability and the environmental attributes of power. And so what we're seeing is a loss of diversity in fuel sources and some disincentives to invest in greener technologies. What are the implications for this? Traditional utilities say that there is a death spiral for them and that this will harm reliability. EPA is working on increasingly regulating, pursuant to the Clean Air Act, air emissions, especially from fossil-fueled power. That, of course, leads the industry to say that a train wreck is coming for reliability, but the stakes are very high, especially with climate change, and especially as we see the proposed Clean Power Plan from EPA looking to states to change their electricity mixes in order to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So a lot is at stake here, and this is why we were interested in the project. Now, to bring this into focus, we use the example of nuclear power. When I say nuclear power, you probably have one of two very strong views. I'll say some words about that a little bit later in the talk, but here's why we chose it. It is a reliable source of base load power, all right? Its life cycle greenhouse gas emissions are comparable to wind and hydro, and it doesn't emit those other air pollutants that are so problematic, especially with coal-fired power. On the other hand, it's being priced out of these markets, And although we saw a little bit of a bump in new reactor construction, that seems to have stalled. So people seem very reluctant to build new reactors. So what we're doing here is the following. All right. And by the way, I do have a draft paper available that goes through these topics in more detail if you'd like to see that. I'll start with some background. I'll talk about how these grids and how the markets work. I'll talk about the the attributes of electricity that we think are most important: cost, reliability, and minimizing environmental externalities. And then I'll say a few words about some of the market failures that we see in this context. To make that all concrete, then we'll switch and talk about the nuclear regulatory regime, some of the risk issues associated with it, and also how it is faring in the markets. Next, I'll look at some policy approaches. What we did with this project, after going through this kind of diagnosis of the problem, was to just briefly collect policy options at the federal, state, and regional level that would either change the markets themselves or change the inputs to those markets. So I'll give a brief review of what those are and then conclude with some implications. What does this mean for how we conceptualize this regulatory contract? All right, the old system. All right, the traditional model for electricity is a vertically integrated utility. A firm that generates its power, sends that power through its own transmission lines, and then delivers that to customers through its own delivery system. This is very much dependent on the regulatory contract. The rates are set by the relevant state utility commission. And this has been the model really up until the 70s. By the way, it is still the model in some states. Here's just an image of the grid. All right, so the transmission has to take place on high voltage lines. The different colors here just relate to the various voltage ratings of the lines. The grid is managed according to 3 major networks with smaller groupings or power pools within them. Texas, by the way, has tried to mostly block itself off to avoid federal regulation, although in order sort of exchange of doing that, it also follows most of the same requirements as federal regulation. And it's important to understand about the grid that it operates in such a way that requires supply and demand to be in constant balance. So all of these different facilities are connected. We have dispatch centers that actually ensure that at any given point when there's a demand, that the load is available to meet that demand. Grid operators have to do this very carefully or you have failures, brownouts, blackouts, costing billions of dollars. By the way, if you're interested, this is actually a board game that you can play and you can practice being your own grid operator. All right, let me say a few words about what has changed. And I can go into more detail if you're interested during the question and comments portion of the talk. But in the 70s, Congress passed the statute that we'll just call PURPA, we'll use its acronym. And what it did was introduce non-utility generators to the fuel mix. It incentivized construction of small renewable facilities. And these were facilities that did not own transmission lines. So increasingly there was pressure on those transmission systems to open up that grid, to give access to these new facilities that had been incentivized by PURPA. And so in 1996, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission issued Order 888, which mandated that wholesale transmission lines would be open to anyone on a non-discriminatory basis. What did this mean? It meant all of a sudden we started having more and more merchant generators. Generators of electricity that are not necessarily operating under that regulatory contract model, but are selling directly into the wholesale markets, using others' transmission lines, and markets develop out of these changes. Meanwhile, the states are also engaging in retail restructuring, introducing competition at the retail level. And so as a result, here's what we have today. More of electricity than ever before is exchanged on these markets. We have wholesale markets and retail markets. we have operators of these markets, at least in some regions of the country. The dark green uses the old system still, so there's coordination for reliability, but we don't have these regional operators that are actually running markets in these green sections. Lots of third-party transactions, and geographically we have very broad markets. If you look at this one, MISO, this blue one, it goes from Canada all the way down to the Gulf there, and that's a single market for electricity. All right, how about some transitions for the greening of the grid? I'm going to assume that you all are probably more familiar with some of these. Renewable portfolio standards started really coming into play in the 80s. So this is where states either mandate or set targets for the percentage of electricity generation in the state coming from renewable resources. PURPA itself incentivized integrated resource planning. This is a way of incentivizing states to think more broadly about the costs and benefits when they're exercising their siting authority and permitting authority. So perhaps a state might consider, should we permit another coal-fired power plant within our borders, or should we be looking at renewables to satisfy some of this new capacity? And then, of course, we have all kinds of developments in the Clean Air Act, especially starting in 1990 with criteria, air pollutants, with cross-state air pollution, toxics, and then, of course, developments right now on the greenhouse gas front. So big transitions over the past 30 or 40 years. All right. I'll shift now into those attributes of electricity that we spend a bit of time on in the paper. Again, we want to minimize cost. We'd like to maximize reliability and the flexibility of fuels. And we'd also like to minimize the environmental externalities associated with those fuels. Before I get into that, let me just give you a little bit of background. The Energy Information Administration publishes these charts on an annual basis. The line down the middle is a snapshot, this is actually from 2011, that shows the relative mix of fuel sources for electricity. And then you can see dating, out to 2040 what the projections are. I should note that this particular chart makes projections assuming no meaningful regulatory changes. So if we take the status quo, if we take the existing regulatory landscape, this is what's projected. And so just to point out a few of the things that we'll be focusing on, notice that coal here is at about 42%, nuclear about 20%, natural gas, look at this increasing share, from 13% in the early 90s up to a projected 30% in 2040. And we see modest but not huge gains in renewables over this same time period. I should note down here too, oil. We don't talk a lot about oil being burned for electricity, but it does sometimes get burned for electricity. It's, of course, one of the worst sources in terms of externalities. All right, so with this background in mind, was there a question? Oh, okay.
Compared to what? Compared to coal?
Yes.
More externalities?
Yes. Yes. Some of those old coal plants, actually, if they are called on to operate, do so in violation of Clean Air Act standards. They simply can't even meet them.
The old coal plants or old oil?
I'm sorry, old oil.
Thank you.
So sure. So let me talk about cost for a minute. And here what I'm going to focus on is the levelized cost of electricity. To give you some background, the industry does not like to tell us its cost numbers, but a variety of consultants as well as governmental organizations periodically make estimates. If we were to construct a power plant today, how much would it cost over the lifetime of that plant? And so this is measured in dollars per megawatt hour. Okay. Levelized cost of electricity includes everything. It includes capital costs, it includes fixed and variable costs, operation and maintenance, the cost of financing, and it's based on the entire lifetime of the plant. So we're talking 30, 40, 60 years. These numbers, I should note, entail lots of assumptions. And so if you were ever to compare these kinds of numbers with other studies, you would need to look carefully at what the assumptions are. The reason I use this data, it comes from the Energy Information Administration, is really to give you some relative sense of how these fuels compare, not to suggest that this is a hard and fast number that an investor might make every decision on. But notice what it shows. Nuclear is fairly expensive on a megawatt hour basis at $96 per megawatt hour. Utility scale photovoltaic solar is of course much more expensive, which you might predict knowing how much panels cost. Look how much cheaper natural gas is compared to those others. Another way to think about what these numbers mean is to look at the capital costs as a percentage of the entire cost. Here, it's very interesting to see capital costs for natural gas are quite low compared to the other fuel sources. This means that that regulatory contract that incentivizes investment by recouping capital costs is not as necessary to construct natural gas. By comparison, you can see that nuclear, wind, and then utility scale solar have much higher capital costs, at least as a percentage of their overall costs. Finally, I just want to show you the variable costs here, and this really gives you a sense of fuel costs. Okay. Of course, our renewables have zero fuel costs. All right. Nuclear has quite low fuel costs. All right. Natural gas actually has the highest. Notice this is a range. One worry that people have about natural gas is, are we predicting the future prices of this particular resource accurately? And then you can see coal here is somewhere in the middle. So how does this relate to those wholesale markets I mentioned? The wholesale markets operate on spot markets or day-ahead transactions, and firms bid in a price that they're willing to accept based on their short-run marginal cost. This is the amount of money that it takes to generate one additional unit of electricity. All right, so imagine coal. If you want to generate more electricity, you have to burn more coal. So the cost of your coal to generate that additional amount is going to make up most of your bid price. All right. So this is why fuel costs are so important when we're talking about how these wholesale markets operate. Now, the way power is dispatched is to meet demand. So we said the grid operators have to balance supply and demand. And so they dispatch power in order of the lowest to the highest cost up to the point where demand is met. So let's say wind bids in at zero. It might. The grid operator will take all of the wind. But let's say it still needs more energy to supply the demand. It'll go to the next cheapest fuel. That's probably nuclear. Once it's maxed out on nuclear, it will go to coal. But it's all based on price. So the grid operator is not necessarily looking to see what kind of generation source is being offered here. It's simply looking at the prices. The reason the resources stack up the way they do is because the fuel sources cost different amounts. Right. Well, how does this relate to plant profitability? You might be an electricity generator who has a competitive bid, but because of technical grid constraints, your power can't go into the grid. Maybe there's a bottleneck in the transmission lines. Maybe the next higher increment, the cost increment, has to be taken from someplace else. So we do have, it's called security constrained dispatch. Least cost, but subject to those constraints of the technical grid requirements. Various factors do lower those market clearing prices. All right, low fuel costs for natural gas, for example. Renewables sometimes bid in at negative prices. That also lowers the overall cost. And the important point is that for plants to earn money, okay, they have to regularly get higher prices on the market than their long-run average costs. I'll make that more concrete when we get to nuclear, but that is a requirement of actually making money. And if you can, maybe I'll give you my example, and then I'll come back to questions. All right, let me say a few words about the next criterion, reliability and flexibility. All right, this is important for balancing those loads, for making sure that the grid operates, and also for keeping prices low. And I'll say a few words now about the features of our different sources of generation. Dispatchable resources are the ones you can call anytime to meet demand. Base load is basically the minimum load that you always need to have in the wires to satisfy a basic minimum amount of demand. Typically, that's coal and nuclear. They run efficiently when they're always running. They do not ramp up and down very well. We also have intermediate load plants. They fill a gap. They don't necessarily ramp as quickly as what we'll call peak load plants, but they can be cycled down. So typically there we have natural gas, and we also use some coal for that as well. And then we have peaking plants. These are plants that can be brought online quickly as needed for high demand. They have to be able to turn on and off. Natural gas does that very well, and some hydro can also do that. Right. We also have, of course, the non-dispatchable resources. These are our renewables. The reason they can't be dispatched anytime you want them is because the sun might not be shining, the wind might not be blowing, we may have a drought, and hydro may not be available. Their marginal costs, of course, are very low. Their fuel costs are zero, so they tend to be dispatched into the grid whenever they're being produced. When they stop, when the wind stops blowing, for example, the grid operator has to immediately call up other resources to balance that load. Just to give you an example, this is a graphic of how different types of fuel sources were dispatched on a single day in California. What you can see here at the bottom is nuclear satisfying base load. QF, that's qualifying facilities. Those are those small renewable and efficiency projects that came from PURPA. The thermal plants are here. That's mostly coal, some natural gas. Imports, so there's actually quite a bit of nuclear in those imports as well. And then they used hydro, and then here you see those peaking plants, typically natural gas. So you can show as demand increased, some of these resources also increased, but they also added more on relative to the times of lower demand. All right. I'll say just a few words about environmental externalities. And again, I'm assuming that this audience has probably the best picture of what those are. So I'm just going to capture some of the highlights. We have some terrible environmental externalities associated with every single fuel source. I think right now the one that's most prominent in people's minds is air emissions, particularly the ones that come from fossil fuels. Not just the greenhouse gases, but of course the more traditional air pollutants. Solid waste, a big issue both for coal and for nuclear power. Water use, of course, is a huge issue for thermal plants. These are the ones that use steam to generate electricity. That's coal, that's nuclear, and some kinds of natural gas. I don't have it on this graphic, but of course wind has its own externalities, problems with migratory birds, with bats, interfering with air, with radar for military applications. The list goes on, but we did focus for this project on generation itself. So of course there are a lot of externalities also associated with fuel extraction, with construction of these facilities. We didn't focus on these, although we of course acknowledge that they play a big part in the overall environmental profile of these different fuel sources. All right, so I have here just a brief summary of fuel attributes, and the bottom line here is that none of these fuels does everything. We do need a mix of them to satisfy the technical requirements of grid operation. All right. We of course know that they line up differently in terms of their externalities, and they have different economic profiles. Maybe a high capital cost with very low fuel prices, maybe a low capital cost with higher fuel prices. So quite a mix. All right, let me say a few words about markets. Yeah, okay, this is the comic relief. That's it. All right. Ideally, what will happen in these competitive markets is that every firm will produce where their average costs equal the marginal cost, and that equals the market price. All right. This is why firms are expected to bid at their marginal costs. But there are problems with these markets. One is called the missing money problem. Consumers, in particular, in most states, do not get price signals. You don't know when your electricity actually costs more to generate or when it costs less. You pay usually a flat amount. All right, so prices are not fluctuating. Demand, that is not fluctuating in response to temporary high prices. If we had markets that allowed that, then high prices would, in the short run, reduce demand. All right, but in the long term, if we had high prices, more investors would be willing to add new capacity to basically produce more of the product to meet that demand. But as the markets actually operate, we don't have that. And so one concern of economists is that we are losing the capacity we need on these grids to maintain a reliable electricity supply. Another problem that I want to mention is called asset specificity. All right, firms with high capital costs, when they construct at a particular location for a particular purpose, aren't nimble. They can't redirect those resources elsewhere. And in a competitive market, that puts them at a disadvantage in price. Economists also worry that this dynamic is accelerating a loss of fuel diversity because the higher capital cost projects aren't being built. How about valuing the environment? Well, we have lots of literature on that too. Some of the traditional approaches say that we should tax pollution, that we should create tradable permitting systems. And we do have some examples of those types of approach, but generally American law uses regulation. Particularly through the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act, we regulate externalities of our electricity sources in that matter. But as I think the symposium suggested last week, most people think that those are suboptimal levels of regulation, that basically we're not doing enough to internalize the externalities. So what do those markets do with externalities and reliability? Not much. All right. Reliability is a technical matter, does constrain the way electricity is dispatched. All right. Pollution controls do increase the long-term average costs of facilities. So for example, if you have to put on a new scrubber, that does increase your cost over time. Production tax credits, RPSs, do permit the fuel sources that can take advantage of those to bid in at lower prices. So they do get earlier access to the grid. But really these spot markets are just designed to run off of short-run marginal costs. These other values only come in indirectly. So let me shift to the example of nuclear power to make some of this concrete. And I'll start with the licensing regime. One of the things that is different about nuclear power is it has a single, federal, robust, comprehensive, and preemptive licensing regime. Right? We do have a federal licensing regime for hydropower, but I think nuclear goes even further than that. Licensing requires adequate protection of public health and the environment. This is a standard that does not require, does not permit cost-benefit analysis. All right? So if the agency, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, requires something for adequate protection, it must be done, regardless of cost. All right? Nuclear also has to establish trust funds when they start operating for their ultimate decommissioning. All right? This could be 30, 40, 60 years into the future. No other fuel source that I'm aware of has to do that. There are some variations in states, but this seems to be the most robust example. Nuclear has to pay to handle its waste. It has to pay for solid waste, nuclear waste disposal. We have significant policy issues in this country about what ultimately to do with that waste. The point here is that nuclear generators internalize those costs. All right. So even though we don't necessarily have a comprehensive and effective policy for what to do with it, they do pay for it. They, of course, have to pay for replacement parts and upgrades. These are more expensive than any of the other sources of generation. And then there's backfitting. To meet the standard of adequate protection, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission can order at any time a modification of a license. So, for example, after Fukushima, NRC convened a task force to evaluate all of the regulations and recommend new things to do with the plants, both management practices and actual equipment upgrades. And so these can cost millions of dollars. Just a few of the examples from Fukushima cost $30 to $50 million per reactor. And those can come at any time. So that's another cost. And then nuclear also has to pay, they have to buy the maximum amount of insurance available on the market in the event that there is an accident. So our point here is to say not that this is wrong, but that nuclear, more than any other fuel source, internalizes those potential environmental externalities. All right. It also has a risk premium. And I spoke in more detail about this yesterday. Nuclear is considered a high dread risk. If something goes wrong, it's catastrophic. People are afraid of it because it has the potential to do such harm. All right. It's also not something you can see. Radiation is scary because it's not familiar to us. Some of the literature suggests that when you have a high dread risk, you wind up with more regulation than is economically efficient. All right. It's also something that's very susceptible to punctuating events. All right. This is something like Fukushima. All right. Something that happens in the news in a single place that translates and impacts the entire industry. The nuclear industry is very aware that it is closely linked worldwide and has a concern that safety be met everywhere, that it's in place because it's so susceptible to these events. It's also marked by sustained opposition, always can count on regulatory and litigation expenses associated with it. And just to give you a sense, this kind of goes back to that punctuating event idea. I'll say in a few minutes about some of the reasons for what we see here. But this is global nuclear reactor construction going back to the 50s and up to 2005. You can see it's climbing here, especially in the 70s. This is 3 Mile Island. This is Chernobyl. And this is what happened with construction. So there are a lot of things going on there, which I'll talk about in a minute. But I think it illustrates how susceptible it is to those punctuating events. So what is our history with nuclear power and the economics of it? In the 70s, actually the 50s and 60s, these were the predictions. People expected demand for electricity to skyrocket. They expected natural gas shortages. In fact, natural gas was banned from being used as an electricity fuel. Oil prices were escalating. People were concerned about national security. And we also had in place a very strong regulatory contract. We didn't yet have those markets. So there was this sense that if you wanted to build these plants, you would be able to do it and recover your costs from consumers. Well, what actually happened? Demand tapered off. Natural gas was deregulated and those prices came down. The oil markets recovered. We had 3 Mile Island. We had Chernobyl. At the same time, in response to these two events, there were a lot of regulatory delays and changes in the requirements. So plants were under construction and learning as they were constructing about new things they had to do. There was litigation going on at every change, and so we have delay and extra expenses there. And then finally, what ended up happening is a lot of plants got canceled. Many got partially built and abandoned. And these plants found that they couldn't recover their costs. Even though the decision to construct had been prudent at the time it was made, Many regulatory commissions in states across the country refused to allow the power plants to capture those costs in their rates. And so those were borne by shareholders. All of those things mean we have a lack of trust in the regulatory contract in regulated states because we have that history of being denied cost recovery. In the wholesale markets, we've got the missing money and the asset specificity problem, both of which suggest that nuclear is not the best option. And then we layer onto that, in any case, the risk perception issues, Fukushima, litigation, and uncertainty with what to do with spent nuclear fuel. And we don't have a lot of new construction happening. It's also difficult for these power plants to compete in the markets. One of the things that you'll read in the papers is the industry will complain. Low natural gas prices and renewable access is hurting us, and that means the market is wrong. We wanted to look more specifically at what they meant by that, and here's how it is. They do have these very low fuel costs. For nuclear power, because it's always running, there isn't a marginal increase in fuel associated with the next output. The fuel is there, you reload it every 18 months to 2 years, and you always have the same output. All right. Because they have to always run, they have to take whatever price is there. And those long-run average prices for nuclear encompass all the things I listed in the regulatory regime. The insurance, the decommissioning, the fuel management, the backfitting, the upgrades, and a highly trained workforce. This means that it's very difficult for nuclear to get the prices needed on the market to cover all of those costs. So what are some conclusions from this? The regulatory contract is very amorphous. You can't count on it necessarily. And we think there are some interesting implications for other grid resources. Although we focus on nuclear power here, anything that's going to require a high capital investment, like utility scale solar especially, is going to also be susceptible to some of these problems. We can see that risk perception matters in terms of what our fuel mix is. I spoke yesterday about smart meters. There are places where people have resisted having smart meters installed because they are concerned about the risks associated with that technology. And we can see that many benefits are not valued. All right. So we think about, well, do we need to reform the regulatory contract? We know we don't have this stylized model anymore. Instead, we have this multiple relationship network in place. In the paper, we talk a little bit about the political economy of various solutions. And one of the things we focus on is the fact that we have gridlock in DC. We don't think that policy options at the federal legislative level are something we can count on right now. And so in collecting various options and looking what scholars have suggested, we have made a point to stay away from that particular type of approach. Well, what are some federal initiatives? We do think that there is room for agencies acting within the scope of their discretion to do quite a lot. So in the paper, we collect a few, people have suggested carbon adders, that the markets themselves could require an extra cost of carbon. We suggest as well, perhaps a reliability adder. Some fuel sources are more reliable than others. Maybe we should find a way to directly value that in the markets. We suggest that carbon adders, while they're arguably something FERC could do, we think politically it probably wouldn't because it strays kind of far from FERC's traditional regulatory role. Of course, EPA is doing quite a lot with Clean Air Act regulation. And then we spend some time on what the NRC is doing in nuclear regulation. The NRC has done some very interesting things in the past. About 20 years ago, it completely revamped its procedural rules for how power plants get licensed. So we know that at times this agency has been willing to make major changes. We suggest that we need to have some pilot approaches to new technology. Small modular reactors have a lot of promise for the future. The military uses them. But if they were to have to go through the same licensing procedures that we currently have for the big plants, they simply wouldn't be economically viable. We also wonder if some sort of shared authority with the states might ultimately be a good result. And I can talk more about this in the Q&A session, because we think that's probably that might promote some strong reactions. But we do think it should be on the table as we're thinking about these issues. Some state initiatives. Obviously, we know that we have renewable portfolio standards. Some states are moving toward the idea of low carbon fuel standards to capture more than renewable values. And certainly the nuclear industry is pushing for that because it would value nuclear as well. Some states that use IRP processes do actually use the cost of carbon in their cost-benefit analysis for deciding whether to permit a new electricity generation source. What we're seeing very interesting on the nuclear front at states is quite a lot of creativity in encouraging new construction for nuclear power and also trying to keep the existing nuclear projects in the marketplace. Georgia and South Carolina are the only two states in which new construction is occurring under a new process. We also have a different reactor being constructed by the Tennessee Valley Authority. Those two states passed statutes expressly permitting that recovery for construction works in progress would be permitted. In permitting that, the states also required quite a lot of updating from the nuclear power companies, lots of cost updates, lots of state oversight, but that seems to have been an important part of prompting the construction of the only new reactors right now in this country. New York has permitted one of the big nuclear companies to renegotiate some of its contracts. This will raise prices for ratepayers. New York says we have to have nuclear power to meet our reliability constraints and also to meet the air profile that we would like to have. And some states are considering whether to allow cost recovery for the difference between the wholesale market prices and the revenue that is needed by nuclear power plants. I should note that that's probably not going to fly under the Supremacy Clause. There's some other litigation that suggests that that approach is not constitutional. We also have some regional initiatives. I'll just briefly mention we do have voluntary carbon trading in the Northeast. We have regional entities that govern reliability for the grid. This tends to be focused on technical reliability. Some of these wholesale markets have not just the spot markets, but capacity markets, where you actually bid in a willingness to have capacity available. This is how they try to deal with that missing money problem. Other states have looked at removing caps that they have on retail rates, allowing those prices to fluctuate much more. And then dating back to the 70s, there's this idea of social cost dispatch. This kind of sounds like the carbon adder, the idea that in addition to marginal cost, we would have to consider the marginal social cost of that extra unit of electricity and making the pricing decisions. There is quite a lot of political opposition to that approach. There's also a lot of political support for it. Some economists say, here, I have a formula for how to do this, so there is quite a lot of research in this area. Other economists say that this wouldn't work. So we have a lot of experimenting going on at all of these levels. And on one hand, this could seem very daunting. But I do actually think that there's reason for optimism here because there is such experimentation. We're seeing this increasing heterogeneity, especially in the states. Look at what has happened with nuclear power. A very federalized scheme, but states are really driving the attempts to keep that fuel source in the mix. And so we suggest that the regulatory contract is better conceived as a network, something that's flexible enough to incorporate lots of different policy measures at many different governance levels. We collect some of the research looking at these policy options. I should note that some of the professors here, Professor Craig, Professor Davies, have been influential in shaping some of our lists of options. But we argue now what we need is consideration of how some of those options would work together. What happens if we layer some of those options, and what will that do? If we think about the regulatory contract this way as something flexible, our hope is that we can make advancements toward low cost, reliable, and green electricity. Thank you. That's the end of my prepared comments, and I would love to hear your questions and comments. Thoughts? Yes.
There's been a lot in the news about the Southern Company reactor down, is it in Georgia?
It is in Georgia.
And cost overruns
Yes.
and everything else. Just in the last week or so, I read an article or two. What's your take on that and your analysis on the economics of nuclear power?
So you're right, first of all. They are experiencing cost overruns. This is Southern Company. They say that basically now they have construction litigation. They argue that this is a subcontracting problem. They claim that they're not worried. Customers in Georgia are concerned. And so, I do think that as we look at these predicted costs of nuclear power, especially because we have not had new construction in over 30 years, it's very hard to accurately predict what a new one will cost. And so I think that because of that, we do have to consider that they'll probably cost more right now, maybe than predicted. I should note that the reactors currently under construction did benefit from a 2005 law that gave some regulatory insurance for regulatory risk, as well as loan guarantees. So these particular plants do have more of a cushion than others in the future might have, but there is definitely some uncertainty there.
Well, that was going to be my second question, was you mentioned insurance for nuclear power. Is there really such an animal out on the commercial market?
Yes.
Or is it all government guaranteed?
It's both. It's both. Nuclear reactors have to buy what is available on the markets, and I forget, it's in the hundreds of millions of dollars. Beyond that, we have to go to Congress if there are problems. And then it sets up an administrative system for any claims. So some of you might be familiar with how vaccine injuries are handled in this country. There's a regulatory system for claims about harm caused by vaccines. This is a similar system for the nuclear industry. Back.
So do you mind just following up on the loan guarantee? That is, so my understanding is it's $6+ billion in loan guarantees, and this seems like a classic externalization of risk. That is, the entire U.S. bears the risk of default on loan, where based on the grid, not the entire U.S. is likely to see that benefit. And how does that externalized risk fit in with your sort of paradigm that otherwise new plants typically internalize a lot of costs?
I think that's actually a great point. So this is something I should address in the paper, and I appreciate you mentioning it. I think that for these plants being constructed right now, you're right. That is spreading a cost. It's the risk of the project is not being fully internalized. That is, if they have to actually come to those loan guarantees. Certainly, I think for existing plants in operation, what I said should hold true. But you make a good point. I will note that those loan guarantees were very limited for a short time period, and probably nobody else can get them. So everybody is watching to see the experience of these reactors. So you had a question too.
Another externality that's not accounted for internally, the cost which has not been evaluated or even settled upon of disposing of nuclear waste.
So we tried to look at this from the perspective of the economics of the operating firm. All right. So absolutely. I think one of the biggest challenges for nuclear power is the waste disposal issue. These plants have been paying for that. Okay. So in terms of the costs to them, all right, they pay to manage the fuel on site, to keep it in fuel pools, to move it to dry casks, and to keep it there indefinitely. Up until a year or two ago, they were also paying into a nuclear waste fund for the construction and ultimate disposal of waste at Yucca Mountain. So from the perspective of that economic actor, it has internalized those costs. You're right, that doesn't mean we have a solution from a policy perspective of what to do with that. So, yes, I'll go.
Utah has an in-progress attempt to build a merchant nuclear reactor near Green River, Utah. Is that the only one of those, or are there a bunch of other merchant nuclear reactor projects we haven't heard of?
In Utah, or?
In our country. That means not connected with the utility but itself into the grid.
Oh, so there are many existing merchant nuclear plants operating right now, first of all, and those are typically in the states that are deregulated. So I can go back to a map and show you that. If you want to get a sense of what is possibly in the pipeline, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission maintains a list of initial applications that have been filed. Last I checked, were about 17. All of those have actually stalled. Those federal benefits expired, and so it doesn't look like those are going forward. From my understanding, the Utah one is in a much earlier stage, and so it hasn't even filed anything with the NRC yet. But yes, I think people are evaluating it. It does look like in regulated states, nuclear might still be a fairly viable economic option if there's public support for it. So, yes.
So at the end of your paper, you give a bunch of different options and policy proposals. I don't know if I have two questions or two more. So one is, what do you think in terms of federalism? Is it better to have maybe a top-down approach to try to coordinate all these in a way that makes sense, or is it better to sort of continue experimentation at the state, the regional, and local level? And the second part is, how do you measure that?
Right.
Because you've identified a few different values, right? Reliability, cost, externalities. We can talk about whether there's others. That strikes me as all good metrics, but also sort of pushes toward this idea of like multiple use, sustained yield, and there are multiple values embedded within that analysis. So which one matters more, or is it we have to optimize all of them?
Right. You ask tough questions. On the governance issue, we take the approach in this paper of saying, right now the federal government is not a unified or a unifying institution. So although, I mean, there's pros and cons of any approach, I do think that EPA and it being a driver of climate change initiatives is an interesting model, considering that it's relying on the states to be creative in coming up with ways to meet the proposed Clean Power Plan. And so, you know, what I see there, at least my impression, is that states are confused. They're not sure how they would do something like that. At the same time, I think that federal leadership, if it goes through, if it's finalized, and if it's upheld, will actually spur more state and really regional initiatives. And I think that would be a good thing. One of the things we see with fuel sources is that some of them work better in some places than others. And so having something that sort of paints with a broad brush and is uniform across the country doesn't seem to make sense to me. So I don't have a set answer on what is the optimal thing to do, but that's my sense as a policy matter. In terms of how to measure, that's a very good question. I've grappled with this in some other research. You know, how do we objectively measure whether statutory mandate goals are being met? And we instead have these surrogates for measuring that. We look to see whether agencies have behaved arbitrarily and capriciously. We don't necessarily say they've done the best thing they can for the environment. We put procedures on agencies at all levels to act as a proxy for what we would like to see substantively. And so there, you know, one measure is public acceptance, sort of a democratic value kind of measure. I think we can look at, we certainly have metrics looking at reductions in pollution, for example. We can look at lives lost or saved with different energy changes. And so I do think that we can use those kinds of metrics to measure some sorts of progress, but in a more abstract kind of way. I'm not sure that's something we can measure. I'm not sure we can find a baseline for much of our energy and environmental policy. I saw some other hands up. Let's see. Back? No? So, all right. Well, thank you all very much. Oh, one more?
You know, I guess I'm just curious. I think I don't really have any idea about what's happening, but in terms of China and the United States, and you know, China seems to have not these impediments that they can. You know, sometimes you think, okay, we have a problem with greenhouse gases, so wouldn't it be nice to do renewables, and wouldn't it be nice to have more nuclear? And you know, I mean, people who are at more of the scholarly level that you're talking about, and being able to evaluate, you know, pros and cons, and are we driving off a cliff in terms of climate change, things like that. You know, China seems to be, they do have 1 billion and some odd people, but they seem to be way more, I met some students who were from Beijing, you know, and they're surprised at how the antipathy that Americans have toward their own government. And they feel this warmth and love of their government. And you know, maybe that's the nature of the systems, but I guess I'm wondering from, you know, just stepping back, how do you think China is doing? Do you have a sense of that compared to the United States in terms of achieving, improving, dealing with climate change, for example?
I'm not sure I have enough information to give you an informed response. You know, on one hand, China can build nuclear power plants quite quickly and litigation-free. On the other hand, they're also constructing at a rapid pace coal-fired power plants, and we're not sure about the emissions limitations there. So I'm afraid I don't have a good answer. You know, I think one of the things we value in this country about government is transparency. Even when it shows us things we don't like, we like to see. I'm not sure we have the same ability, especially as Americans, to look inside China's system and be able to evaluate that. I'm afraid that I don't. So I'm sorry that I wouldn't feel comfortable answering.
Yesterday on the radio I heard something interesting. It said that they were talking about nuclear and energy and things, and they said that Germany has been doing so many wonderful things in terms of renewables, and the bottom line has been, surprisingly, they said, I don't know what the source was, that CO2 emissions in Germany have been going up over this period. And in the United States, we seem to have a lot of the gridlock, but over the same period, greenhouse, I think that the rate of CO2 emissions is actually going down. And some of that may be natural gas first. I don't know all the reasons, but
Well,
but it is, you know, it is. I mean, we are in the U.S., but we've got, you know, we're 300 out of 7 billion.
right, right. I mean, we do see, and I think Professor Davies maybe can comment on this more if I can put you on the spot, but after Fukushima, Germany decided not to use nuclear power. Right now, we don't have enough renewables in any country that I know of to replace that baseload requirement. We have to use coal. And so we also see locally in the United States, some of the places where these nuclear plants have shut down, we have seen at least temporary increases in air emissions, not just greenhouse gases, but traditional pollutants, because we've had to use coal to step in and fill that gap. So yes?
How about France, which
Yes.
is still 50% nuclear or so?
More than that, I think, yes. France is very interesting. You're right, they do. One of the things I talked about a little bit at this talk I gave yesterday was different perceptions of risk. It varies somewhat by country. The US is full of individualists who maybe have less trust for the government. France tends to be more hierarchical, more trusting of the government and accepting of government policies. And those differences also correlate to acceptance of nuclear power. So as we think about fuel sources and options, I do think it's important to consider people perceive these types of technologies and are willing to accept them differently in different places. So, all right. Thank you all very much for your questions and for listening.